So, good afternoon and welcome. My name is Victoria Keane and I'm from the Homes England Local Government Capacity Centre. And I'm delighted to welcome you to our summer learning programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you've told us are of interest to you. And today's session is on affordable housing programme compliance. So, as you can see, I've just taken you through the housekeeping, and then I'm going to move on in a moment to get the Homes England perspective on compliance from Sharon Kenny and Anya Anderson of Homes England. We'll then move on to hear the local authority perspective, and I'm delighted that we've got Jane Davies from Rotherham Council joining us. And then we'll all come together and answer some of your questions in the Q&A. And then we'll get some feedback from you with the polls and the surveys that I mentioned earlier. So please do post your questions in the chat. We'll try and answer as many as we can during the session, either in the chat or during the Q&A. So I'll now hand over to Anya and Sharon. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sharon Kenny, and I'm an Assistant Director working in the Affordable Housing Grants part of Homes England. I've been with the organisation almost 2 years now, but I have worked in the sector. So I've actually been one of those that have had to undergo, as it were, compliance audit as a practitioner, and I now sit on the other side with Anya. So over to you, Anya.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Anya Anderson, and I am a Senior Manager for Compliance Audit. I've worked for Homes England 8 years now, and I lead Compliance Audit Programme, and I am responsible for a small team of 5. So in today's session, if I can ask for the next slide, please, let's just move on to the next.
Thank you.
Thank you. In today's session, we'll discuss compliance. We'll start from explaining the need for regulating delivery of affordable homes, and we will then discuss principles of the Compliance Audit Programme and point you to the right resources on Homes England website. We hope that by the end of the session, you'll not only know how to be compliant, but will also recognize the benefits it brings to your organisation. Can I ask for the next slide, please? Homes England works in synergy with local authorities and other providers to deliver on a shared objective, bringing more affordable homes to the market. As an agency established by the government, we take a responsibility for management and distribution of grant and for secure delivery of homes. Delivery of objectives, however, is always associated with risk. Hence, Homes England must regulate the relevant processes to prevent poor practices and enable the objectives to be achieved. So how do we ensure delivery of affordable homes? We do so by setting the standards that the providers of affordable homes must achieve in order to become eligible for grant, by creating the policies they must follow during a delivery process, and by supervising compliant delivery and implementing enforcement actions when required.
I think how I'd like to put it is within affordable housing, we're the guardians of, for 2021-2026, our latest programme. We're responsible for over £7 billion of affordable housing grants, so public grant money. So as you can see, it's so important that we provide assurance as a team, both internally, to the exec team within Homes England, to the board at Homes England, and to the department, that this money is being spent well and being spent compliantly. It's very important because what it means is we can continue to hand out grants for you to deliver homes with that insurance, as I said, that it's been done correctly. So it's a shared objective. We all want to deliver more affordable homes. This particular function provides a huge amount of assurance for the agency that we're doing it properly.
Thank you. Can I ask for the next slide? So we know now that regulatory requirements are there to enhance the capability of successful delivery. Let's take a look at other benefits compliant delivery brings to your organization. It strengthens the control environment. And thanks to that, the risks are reduced and impact lessened if risks materialize. It supports you in achieving the objectives, and it enhances compliance culture within your organization. You'll also gain the benefit of improved effectiveness and decision-making processes. Not forgetting increased Homes England confidence in you as a reliable partner, and what comes with that, an ability to receive grant funding in the future and to deliver more affordable homes to the market.
So if I'm sat as a provider who's received this grant and I generally work in a development department that's delivering these projects, I have assurance within my team anyway. I'm expected through that project to have a number of things in place to ensure that we're delivering this project with good governance and with good assurance around it. And what we do really here at Homes England is just doing a double check on that. We're really checking what you should have within your own organisation, which is a great compliance culture anyway, that I'm sure Jane will talk about in a lot more detail later.
Let me now tell you where to look for an up-to-date compliance guide. So it is the Capital Funding Guide that contains the rules and procedures for all providers delivering affordable housing, and it can be accessed through the government website. Let me remind you that if you have any queries of any aspects of the requirements, always contact your contract manager in the first place. Next slide, please. So we do recognize that a number of factors that impact on both the funding conditions and delivery processes. Some change more frequently than others, but that dynamic nature of the environment creates the need for the policies to be reviewed and updated on a regular basis. And it is the Affordable Housing Policy Team that reviews the policies with the transparency and risk focus in mind, and they introduce updates when required. In order to keep your organization aware and engaged in those changes, we recommend that you firstly subscribe to the Capital Funding Guide update emails, and secondly, perform relevant horizon scanning activities.
So the only thing I want to add to that, Anya, is Capital Funding Guide constantly reviewed, can be constantly updated. And it's either updated it's updated for a number of reasons. It can either be updated because something's changing in the programme. An example of that is a lot of our schemes are now being delivered through modern methods of construction. So what your team are going to be looking at this year, aren't they? Along with Technical Hub, who are our policy gurus. They look after, as we said, policy within affordable housing. We'll be sitting down with them and across affordable housing to say, OK, with our providers now delivering homes that are utilising modern methods of construction, do we need to change our compliance audit process? What does it mean for that?
Definition start on site.
Definition start on site, for example. Do we look at that again? So that's one example where things change. Another way in which we'll do it is Anya's constantly looking on particularly on an annual basis at continuous improvement. So she might get to the end of a compliance audit programme cycle. So she might get to end of March next year and say, OK, what was a bit unclear in the Capital Funding Guide that we can improve? Or is there something in there that we think perhaps isn't fair to partners? So a good example of that is local authorities and valuations. So previously, the Capital Funding Guide actually said for local authorities, even though you might have RICS valuers working within a local authority, you can't use them. They've got to be independent of the local authority. Now, local authorities were saying to us, look, first of all, RICS valuers are independent, no matter where they sit, they're independent. And it doesn't really make sense for us to appoint somebody externally when we have these particular independent valuers present within our organisation. So we looked at that, didn't we, as part of a little task force, and we updated the Capital Funding Guide accordingly. So for about a year now, is it, Anya? For about a year now, what it means is exactly that local authorities can now use RICS accredited valuers from within their organisations to carry out valuations on their schemes, which I think makes a big difference for local authorities. So it's just an example of the way in which, we're constantly looking at how we can improve our Capital Funding Guide, our policy, to make it easier for us and for you.
saving public money as well, thanks to that, and keeping the risk updated.
Absolutely, it saves, as we said in that instance, them appointing somebody external and paying for that cost. As I said, when would they have that particular function in-house, don't they? All right, next one. Next slide, please.
Yes. So you now know why we regulate delivery of homes and where to find the capital funding guide. Let's talk about the Compliance Audit Programme. The program has been established in order to get an assurance about providers' compliance. All providers delivering affordable homes are eligible for audit, and they have a contractual obligation to engage with that process. However, since Homes England audits only a selection of providers each year, some providers will be excluded despite of having eligible schemes. We notify providers selected for audit via email, and for this year's program notifications were sent on the 13th of June. Finally, please note that you are responsible to cover the cost of independent auditor, therefore we recommend that you budget for it in advance.
I just want to again set the context within which this year's programme is now underway. As we said, everybody who's been selected was made aware of that in June. And Anya's team has a very busy schedule from here on in. Basically, the eligible audit sample, as it were, these are some big figures, so get ready. There are over 436 providers who are eligible to be selected this year. That represented nearly 4,000 different types of schemes. It represents a total public funding, affordable housing grant input of nearly, well over £1.6 billion and represents nearly 40,000 units. So that's kind of the size of the sample and the size of the task that Anya's team typically goes through on an annual basis, don't you, Anya? And we pick, what, about 10%-ish? Overall, average, that can vary. So that means about 200 providers have been selected, nearly 350 schemes, way over 200 million grant, and over 4,300 units. So that gives you, as I said, hopefully a feel for what we're talking about here in terms of the size of your compliance audit process and programme and what your team manage.
Thank you. Next slide, please.
We keep crossing over, apologies over next slide. I'll let you do it, Anya.
Listed here are type of programs that are being subject to audit this year. Right to acquire schemes are being audited through a simplified process, where providers selected are asked to submit a statement of grant usage. For this process, there is no need for involving independent auditor, as the statement can be signed off by finance director. All other programs are being audited through the standard audit process, details of which will be presented to you in an upcoming slide.
So all that slide really shows, doesn't it, Anya, is the range of programmes that affordable housing administer and manage. And that constantly changes. And, you know, we're constantly being asked by the department to look at other types of funding. When we do that, obviously Anya's team gets involved from a compliance perspective. What will that might mean? What will that cover? And I think a good example of that, which is a small programme, but has a huge important profile for us and packs a punch within Homes England, which is the Next Steps, now known as the Rough Sleepers Accommodation Programme. It's about 80 million in size, very small, but really important to us, as are the others. The biggest one within there, I'd say, as I said, is the Affordable Housing Programme. Always is, but all of the other programmes show the strength and depth of types of programmes we look after, don't we? And therefore you have to get involved with from a compliance audit perspective, don't you, Anya?
Next slide, please.
This is the best slide, by the way, now, so really listen to this one.
I'll be here a while.
If you're asleep by now, please, this is the one to wake up for and the one to remember. This is the best slide, I think. Carry on, Anya.
Bright colours as well, hopefully that additional feature. The Compliance Audit Programme delivery happens in stages, and that's what the slide represents. An initial stage, excuse me, that takes place straight after the financial year end is a sample generation process. Sharon talked about this before. The system identifies all eligible schemes and selects the proportion to be audited in the upcoming year. Following a sample review and sign-off, notification emails are sent to providers selected for audit. And as mentioned earlier, this year we notified providers on the 13th of June. Together with the notification emails, a comprehensive training pack was also provided. Following notifications, the providers are expected to start arrangements with their independent auditor and also to begin setting themselves up in a compliance audit system. Once independent auditor undertakes the audit, they have 5 weeks to perform the review and to submit their answers directly in the compliance audit system. All findings should be submitted by the long stop date, which for this year has been set up as the 12th of September. Providers then have 10 days to add their comments. They should read independent auditors' answers carefully and use this time as an opportunity to address any misunderstandings and to add any additional evidence. From October onwards, the audit findings will be reviewed by the Homes England lead auditors. The compliance will be assessed and breaches assigned where appropriate. The audit proposed outcome will then be moderated, and following a final sign-off, the reports will be released to providers no later than 31st of March 2023. Providers then must acknowledge the reports directly in the compliance audit system no later than 3 months following the report release date. I've been here a while. If you were to summarize this slide.
I just think it's an important slide because that rhythm of the process that Anya's team follows doesn't really change each year. The dates might, so don't hang your hat on the equivalent of the middle of June being the date you get notified. I think, you know, in terms of what's important on that kind of process flow chart, I think what's really important is the 10-day window. One of the obvious things that some of our providers don't do is that they miss that opportunity. They don't look in that particular system. They don't look in the system in that 10-day window. And there could have been some dialogue going on between us and the compliance auditor, the compliant independent auditor, that might be checking something out, asking for a clarification, and they don't get involved, the provider. And once you miss that 10-day window, you've really missed that opportunity to get involved. So that's really key, that whoever the person is leading from your organisation, as I said, looks in the system through that 10 days. That's the first hint for you. And then they ask for us back, really, and for Anya's team is that everybody who does get selected does provide their audit outcome. In other words, they complete their audits through their independent auditor by that long stop date. Because if it goes there, if you get any delays, that's really hard for Anya's team, because obviously then you're really shoehorning the time where you have a very busy period to review and fairly moderate all of these outcomes, don't you? Because it's a tight timetable, isn't it, for your team?
For us.
The other thing that's probably changed, well, we know has changed in the last couple of years, is the batched approach. Previously, the Compliance Audit Programme just notified every selected provider by the end of March in one go. We now adopt a batch approach. So there are some providers who will probably hear about the end of January. So you will get to hear in a phased approach from January to the end of March next year, which I think is quite helpful to organisations hearing earlier to know how they've done.
And act up on them.
Exactly. And to either go, great, it's a green, or there's some work for us to do and there's some actions for us, recommendations for us to take away and implement within our organisation. So again, last one, that 3 months to acknowledge, please again do that, because that tells us you've acknowledged, you understand, and you're putting in train any actions that you need to implement within your particular organisation, as I said. Thank you. Thanks, Anya.
Next slide, please. Thank you. So this slide lists the key responsibilities for the main stakeholders involved in a process. However, considering the similarity of the content with the previous slide, I'll not talk about it in detail and let you refer to the slide at your own leisure. The key users identified in a table provided are provider compliance audit lead, which is just your delegated person overseeing the audit process, independent auditor of your choice, Homes England Compliance Audit Team, and Homes England Contract Manager, who is your first point of contact. Next slide. So although you are responsible for appointing an independent auditor, you must, there are specified rules that you must follow when making that choice. Key principles have been listed for you on this current slide. And as you can see, they refer mainly to independency and qualifications the independent auditor of your choice must confirm. Next slide. Any further information about the Compliance Audit Programme can be found on the Compliance Audit webpage. It includes Compliance Audit System guidance, but also Compliance Audit System training videos, which are really useful.
They are. I'd certainly recommend them. Either if you're new, as it were, to compliance audit and you're a new organisation that's received grants and has been selected in the sample, they're really bite-sized chunk videos that are really useful. Even if you're an old hand at going through the compliance audit process from a provider's perspective, I think they're really good refreshers, aren't they, on a step-by-step guide through what you've got to do.
They're very short and designed for specific tasks, and with those tasks being performed on an annual basis, it's really, you don't remember the details when you, even if you've done the audit before.
So hint, I think this is the time now,
yes,
I think, to have a good look at them, really, isn't it, and refresh yourself.
Next slide. So now a few comments about the checks performed during the audit program. We use the compliance audit checklist. And the checklist refers to the key contractual requirements and funding conditions seen in the Capital Funding Guide and your funding contract. It is revised annually based on everything we talked about before, dynamic environment, etc. And the set of questions for the forthcoming compliance audit program is always published on the compliance audit webpage. Please note that the number of questions per scheme will depend on funding program, delivery method, and development stage achieved at the point of year end. Next slide. So a few comments now about the audit outcome. The audit outcome will result in one of three grades: green, amber, or red. The grades are linked to the severity of the breaches identified during the audit. The compliance audit report is confidential between Homes England and the provider. And once the report has been issued, any factual inaccuracies may be corrected. Therefore, we highlight to all providers again that any comments regarding independent auditors' findings, additional evidence should be raised during that 10-day window we talked about before. Providers should ensure compliance audit reports and recommendations are brought to the attention of the board chair for housing associations, cabinet members for local authorities, or chief executive directors for developers. Next slide. These are the common areas of non-compliance identified in the past, put in a summary table for you. And we highlighted them for you as a reference point to prompt the discussions within your organization and encourage assessment of your delivery processes from start to finish.
Do you want me to talk about them in a bit of detail, Anya?
Please do.
Okay. In terms of valuation, it's obvious, isn't it? If you're going to buy a site or buy a property, you've got to have a proper valuation in place. Seems an obvious one to have, but yet it seems to be a common occurrence that we do find some of those who are selected for audit don't seem to have this in place, and the independent auditor can't find it. It's completely out of date. Or I think another common one, Anya, is the type of valuation, isn't it? It's got to be a proper red book valuation, not a comparative valuation, isn't it? So that's number one. Other one to hint at, rents. So rents, a common mistake or error on the part of providers is either they're inaccurate and they haven't put in the right rents and they don't match what should be in the system. Seems obvious, but quite a few we find don't match, and then you fall foul with a breach. Another one, which I think is more fundamental, is that the rent setting policy of the organisation isn't quite right. And if we pick that up, I think that's a bit more fundamental. I think that was raised, I think you found an article in Inside Housing, haven't you?
Yes.
That rent setting policies for organisations, and perhaps some of them getting that wrong, is becoming, I think, a little bit more common. So look at that article in the Inside Housing from yesterday about rent setting policies. And I think you raised, didn't you, or mentioned a particular statement which it said, it's in terms of rent setting policies, the regulator highlighted the importance of accurate data and good governance for complying with standards. So that's an important one. The other one is, sounds obvious again, which is at start on site, having your contract in place. We sometimes find there isn't one, which is rather important. You don't really go and start on site without having a building contract in place, or that it's dated after you've actually started on site and claimed the grant. And that's really a big no-no. So it's very important that you check that the building contract predates when you claim your grant. Another obvious one, which is key documents not on file. And occasionally we do have very few documents on file, which tells us that that's not really good governance, isn't it? That there hasn't been a rhythm of people in that organisation keeping a record of the key file documents for compliance audit.
Which could be digital.
It could be digital, but that's really important, and independent auditors will really find that out if that's not there. Seems obvious, but it does happen quite a few times, doesn't it, Anya, that they're not there, unfortunately.
Can we ask for the next slide?
We're nearly finished now.
Yeah, it's the last slide from us. Thank you. So it's just a few concluding points. And our simple advice to you is to keep it green. And you can do so by taking steps to ensure that you know your regulator, that you do things right first time, and that you embrace the compliance culture. And now
we've finished, haven't we, from a Homes England perspective, Anya and I, and we'll hand over the mantle, or the baton, as it were, to Jane. So over to you, Jane.
Thank you very much, Sharon and Anya. I'm just trying to get my camera on. There we are. Thank you. Hi, everybody. I'm Jane Davis, and I'm the Head of Service for Strategic Housing and Development at Rotherham. One of the things I'm responsible for is the Council's Housing Development Programme and ensuring compliance with Homes England's grant funding requirements. The reason I'm here is that we received a negative report following last year's audit, and that's because previously we didn't have all of the correct processes we needed in place to ensure compliance. Since receiving that report in January, the Council's undergone an intense programme of improvement to the way we work, and we've now got a very robust approach to grant funding compliance. So while the audit was disappointing and has been taken very seriously by the Council, the overall outcome's been very positive for Rotherham, and that shows that the compliance audit process does achieve what it's intended to achieve. So I'm here to share some of the key lessons that we've learnt. I recognise that some of you will have been through several compliance audits already, and you'll have a lot more experience and technical knowledge than I do, but others among you might be preparing for your first audit this year. But wherever you are on your journey, I hope you'll all find at least some of this helpful. Before I start with some do's and don'ts, I'll just provide a brief bit of background about Rotherham. So Rotherham is a metropolitan borough in South Yorkshire. We own and manage more than 20,000 council homes, which is almost a fifth of all homes in Rotherham. We've got a large number of people on the council's housing register, and right to buy is really popular here, so we lose a significant number of homes from our stock each year, and therefore we've got an increasing need for social rented homes. So when Homes England's shared ownership and affordable homes programme was launched in 2016, the council embarked on a major housing development programme, and it became a really important corporate priority to deliver as many new affordable homes as possible. So through SOAP, we delivered 227 homes, which was more than the council had built for decades. And at that point, as an organisation, I think it's fair to say we were still relatively new to housing development, and we've come a long way since then. We're really proud of what we've delivered and the really ambitious future pipeline we've built up. 2 of the schemes from that SOAP programme were audited last year, and that's where the breaches were identified that resulted in our negative audit report. We've since changed our practices to make sure the same things can't reoccur in the future. and I'm going to talk through some of that. But really that's just to set some scene, because the advice I'm about to get into is very generic and not specific to Rotherham. So if we could just move to the first slide, please. So some do's. Firstly, probably most importantly, do talk to Homes England at the earliest opportunity if you've got any concerns or questions about your schemes at all. They'll give you advice. They'll always want to have an open, honest conversation with you rather than wait until things have gone wrong. In Rotherham, we have quarterly CRM meetings, customer relationship management meetings, but we don't leave it until there's a formal meeting to raise an issue. We have a lot of dialogue with colleagues at Homes England in between those meetings, and that's really helpful. Next is about changes to schemes, and this is because at the point when you draw down grant, all of the details in IMS must match your scheme file exactly. And that can be a bit of a challenge if you've got different people involved at the bidding stage and submitting the bids onto IMS, from the people who'll be managing the schemes, doing the project management and all of the change control. And it's also a challenge if you have any staff changes at any point. And so communication and clear records of any changes is really important, and those really meticulous project management processes and recording. And I think I'd also recommend you really thinking carefully about the number of offer lines you want to use in IMS for different parts of the scheme to allow flexibility that you might need as the development progresses. So, for example, if you have an offer line for 40 units, and most of that's delivered, but one small section's delayed due to utilities, for example, you can't draw down for that offer line until all 40 units are completed. So it's worth thinking ahead and considering splitting across offer lines in a logical format to help mitigate against some of that risk. Thirdly is about communication. Really talking to all of the teams in your organisation that are involved in housing development about the absolute importance of compliance and their role in achieving it. And I think this is likely to vary from organisation to organisation. In Rotherham, we're a single tier authority, and so we've got everything under one umbrella: planning, highways, internal audit, building control. So we've got a wide range of teams and directorates, all with a part to play in achieving compliance. And while overall accountability for this sits with me and my service, everybody involved needs to know the role that they play and how they can help to ensure compliance. So really getting that message out to all of the relevant people is important. And then finally for this slide is about proactivity. I think it's worth assuming from the very beginning that every scheme that you put onto IMS will be audited, and make sure that you're ready for that from the very beginning. And this relates to making sure that you set up your files for your schemes in a sensible way that's already ready in accordance with the capital funding guidelines and the latest checklists. That's really helped us. Please can we move to the next slide for some more do's. So again, this relates to the previous point. Having a really clear filing structure, a very consistent file naming convention can help, that reflects all of the individual compliance requirements. We've also found it helpful to have sort of front pages on the scheme files with hyperlinks to all key documents where you've got elements that are shared across a number of different offer lines. Now, this is really important to make sure that any key discussions you've had with colleagues at Homes England are on the record, and make sure that if you've had a discussion about a particularly thorny issue and come to a consensus, to make sure that you back that up with an email and file that in your scheme file, because things can be forgotten over time, people can move on, and it's really important that you've got that really good, robust audit trail. It's also important to think about resourcing and make sure that you're aware of any risks, and that you put in place plans to make sure you've got all the right people available when you need them to deliver compliance schemes. And think about particular times that might be more pressured. For example, if an audit's happening over a summer period, you need to bear in mind that certain key people might be away. You might have areas of your organisation where you've got key vacancies or people absent, and you need to make sure that you've got everybody lined up and ready, and that if you know that there are pressures, that you plan ahead for that. example from Rotherham, we involve our finance team to do checks of all the finance data in IMS before we draw down grant. We knew that for one of our schemes, we'd be asking them to do that at the same time they had all their year-end accountancy pressures. So we planned ahead and brought that forward. And I would advise doing that. And then finally for this slide, really, really useful, carry out your own self-assessments against the compliance requirements so that you're really ready. It prepares you for audit. This year, we've been looking through all of the schemes we've delivered previously and doing our own internal audits. We've also used the council's internal audit team to provide some objectivity and further checks. And that's helped us to really proactively identify any problems that we've found so that we can plug any gaps, so that we can discuss this with Homes England and make sure we really know where we are. And I couldn't recommend this strongly enough, to carry out your own assessments rather than waiting to see which ones will be selected. Please can we move to the next slide? I think this is my final slide of do's. So do be realistic. Sorry, could we just go back to the previous slide? I think I might have been out of sync with the slides, thanks. So do be realistic about the deadlines you put in on IMS for grant drawdown. Homes England, I'm sure would agree, would much prefer you to have realistic dates and everything in place before you draw down grant, rather than need to move it closer to the time, because they need to be able to do accurate forecasting of spend and performance, and it helps to reduce some of that stress as well. Make sure that you've built in the time that you need. We've built in time for our milestones to allow finance checks, second checks. As head of service, I do checks, and it's important to have that time in case anything goes wrong at the last minute. I would suggest that you create procedure documents that work for your organisation. You've got the capital funding guidelines and the checklists, and they're really helpful and essential, but you can bring them to life, put them into your own formats. We've created procedures that are really clear with flow charts that name who's responsible for what, and then make sure that's refreshed. So every time you see that there's an update to the checklists or any of the guidelines, tweak it and keep it live. That's really helpful. It's really helpful with communicating across other teams and getting that wider culture in place for compliance. And also support your staff. It's really complex delivering these schemes. There's lots of things to think about. Your staff will be managing a whole range of risks around budgets, around timescales for delivery, everything. And the compliance can't be lost within that. I think it's possibly fair to say IMS is not always the easiest system to use if you don't do it regularly. And you've got to bear in mind that some people aren't doing this as their day job. For example, in my team, we've got a relatively small team and they're responsible for a really wide range of housing functions, of which housing development's one. So people need to be confident, they need to have training, they need that to be refreshed. The links to the videos are really helpful that Anya highlighted earlier. So I would encourage your teams to help each other and have different levels of assurance. So you could have staff perhaps that are less experienced buddying up with others to just do those necessary final checks before anything's drawn down. In Rotherham, as I've mentioned previously, we have finance checks, and then I'll do head of service checks before drawdown can take place, so that we've got that really robust audit trail. Also, don't forget new staff and people that have changed roles, and I'd recommend building this into the induction as well, because it's so important for your organisations. And then finally, if you could just move on to my final slide, please. And this is just finally a few don'ts, and this is really just to reiterate some of the points I've already made so far. So don't hope for the best. What you want to do is to aim for no surprises, and you can do that through really robust preparation, through all of that checking of your own schemes and getting as ready as you can be. In Rotherham yesterday, the schemes that are going to be audited this year were announced. Because we've been preparing for this, I already know those schemes inside out. I know where the issues are and what we've already highlighted. And there's, yeah, as I say, we're aiming for no surprises for the organisation here. Don't leave it too late either. As Anya and Sharon have pointed out, there's a relatively strict time frame for the audit process, and you don't want to leave things too late in case things go wrong, in case key people aren't available, in case you notice a gap in your files that needs plugging. It's about making sure that you've got everybody there and lined up. There might be some probing questions asked, so you need to be ready for that. And so this is just to reiterate that thing about already having conducted your own checks and being as knowledgeable as you can about the schemes that you've delivered. Don't fear the process, it is there to help. In Rotherham, we've come through a difficult audit report and a very rigorous process of putting everything in place that needs to be put in place. And now, dare I say it, I'm almost looking forward to the next audit, because I'm confident about what we've done. I'm confident about future schemes and knowing how we can make sure they're compliant. And just remember as well that Homes England are really supportive. They're there to help. They want us to be compliant. We all want us to be compliant and to support us to make sure that we are. And then finally, this is about a continuing culture of compliance. Don't forget about the outcomes of this year's audit until next year. Whatever the outcome of your audit, Homes England will make recommendations, and then you should be identifying additional actions that would help to make sure that you can prevent any problems occurring in the future. So on our audit that we received this year, Homes England had made 2 recommendations that were repeated over various areas of the report. When we looked at it, we found an additional 11 actions that we needed to take as an organisation. So we've got that action plan, we've delivered it, but we're keeping it under continuous review. So just a year passes in the blink of an eye, and I think it's better to consider this throughout the year. Think about compliance as an ongoing part of your culture, rather than just leaving it until the audit's announced. So I think hopefully I've echoed a lot of what Anya and Sharon were talking about, but just from a different perspective. And I'd like to say thank you very much for listening, and now I will hand back to Victoria.
Wonderful. Thank you, Jane. That was great. I've really enjoyed this afternoon, the brilliant hints and tips. It's all been very engaging, and I've really enjoyed the open dialogue and the very supportive conversation. So that's great. What I'd like to do is invite all of our speakers back. Share your screen, so share your camera, sorry, and come and join us, and we'll try and answer some of the questions. We've had loads of questions in the chat, and it'd be good to go through as many as possible. So if we could have Anya, Sharon and Jane. There we go, we can see your faces. Brilliant. Okay, fantastic. So we've got the first question. And I think this is for Sharon and Anya. And it asks, how are audit schemes selected? There have been a few questions around this, sort of getting the mystery away. Is it purely random choice? Do you focus on selecting specific types of schemes for each organisation? And actually, it's related to another question, which says that that they've had a number of SOAP completions, but most of the compliance has been focused, or the auditing has been focused on SP schemes, strategic partnership schemes. So it'd be good to get a sense of the selection.
Okay, I'm happy to
Okay, thanks,
I'll
Anya.
just start answering this one. And I think the key principles for you to know is that every single scheme that you take up on to deliver can be selected for audit. And suggestion is that you start maintaining the scheme file from the very beginning and be prepared for that audit. But trying to answer directly the question, the process is really complicated, really complex. There's a lot of algorithms that are based on previous grading that providers received in the past. It's worth mentioning that if you receive red or amber grade in the previous audits, you will be selected automatically in the upcoming audit whenever you have eligible schemes. So that's guaranteed. Then in terms of the number of schemes being selected, that is the algorithm that selects the schemes randomly, and there is no principles as such. So answering the question about the mix of SP versus CME schemes, that's the automated process. Proportion, again, that's automated process. We mentioned before that it's about 10% of overall eligible population in relation to the scheme number that we're trying to audit. The system selects providers in the first instance and then goes down to the next level when they select the schemes. And again, it wasn't in a question, but the schemes vary from in-year schemes and completed schemes. So also be aware that some schemes, although they haven't achieved practical completions, they can also be selected for audit.
So we call them either in-year schemes. So as we said, it's a scheme that hasn't reached practical completion, or look back, and we can select any of them. And we have as we said, a computer-generated system with algorithms within it that randomly selects. So, you know, the question I think that's being posed was about SOAP versus strategic partnership. It's just random. So don't think they're not going to get picked for the SOAP schemes next time, because they could do. So and back to what Jane said, I think you've just got to assume that every scheme could be selected. So so you adopt the same process for every scheme that you have, just in case it's you next time, isn't it, Anya?
Absolutely.
Brilliant, fantastic. We have a question that asks, what are the other consequences of an amber or red rating? So you hinted on some of that in terms of future audit, but what are the other consequences?
So maybe again, I start saying that audit is confidential between Homes England and providers, so there's no external consequences. But at the same time, something I just mentioned answering the other question was that by receiving amber or red grade, makes you selected automatically for the audit in the upcoming year. And there's a reason for that. We're giving you a chance to improve. If you look at the audit process, like what Jane was mentioning right at the start, the reason we review the processes, etc., was because we were scored amber already in the past, and there's another failure even on a that resulted in a green grading that was identified by us. So it's kind of the communication between the regulator and yourself as a provider that enhances that dialogue and improve of the processes at your end. So we would expect you to engage post-audit, review your processes, address those inconsistencies, and then allow us to check in the upcoming year. Obviously, amber and red vary depending on the severity because of the risk that relates to the breach that has been identified. And we do discuss them on an individual basis. In extreme cases, when there is a deliberate fraud or the risk has been identified as really high and may have spread to other schemes as well, because remember that we only audited the sample of your schemes. So again, there will be an open dialogue and a possibility of discussions around the overall delivery of your program and the processes as such, rather than just that particular scheme that we audited.
She's being polite. Oh, you know, 99.9% of the time, it's about continuous improvement, and it's everything that Jane said. We're identifying flaws, we're identifying, you know, things, processes that really you need to improve. So it's all about continuous improvement for 99.999%. Ultimately, though, the compliance audit function is our line of defence. So if we find something absolutely mad and bad, as we call it, you know, something really fundamental, we can take away what we call a provider's investor partner status. So ultimately, they won't get any more grants, or we might pause it for a time if we think that we need to work with them. So there is an ultimate consequence to it, which isn't great. But for the vast majority, it's about working with you, isn't it, to improve? I think we're done, aren't we, Anya, on that one?
Yeah, I think so.
Yeah, brilliant. No, that's great. And that level of support that you offer is evident there, so that's great. I have a question now for you, Jane. Have you developed shared ownership and/or rent to buy? And if so, are there any differences between the compliance requirements dependent on the tenure being delivered?
Thanks, Victoria. Yes, we've delivered over 100 council shared ownership homes. We haven't done rent to buy, but we've done shared ownership. And much of the requirements in the checklist are the same, regardless of tenure, but there are some additional areas that you need to look at for delivering those other products. So examples from memory for shared ownership include things like ensuring you've got the right insurances in place post-completion, making sure that you've got the right eligibility checks for people accessing shared ownership, that service charges have been calculated and recorded correctly. So there are additional elements for shared ownership, but much of it's the same.
I think the one to watch, Jane, isn't it, that I think we as an organisation have updated, particularly in the capital funding guide, the shared ownership lease. That was changed in the last 12 months. So hint, that's, I think, a particular part of the capital funding guide I think organisations need to be familiar with, because it has changed.
Great, fantastic. I used to be a teacher, and I love this conversation because it sounds a little bit like me giving advice to GCSE geography students. You better read this particular chapter. Brilliant, thank you. I think it's really helpful for everybody. I have a question now for Anya and Sharon. There are two questions actually, and there's one in the chat that's recently come in, and then there's one that came in much earlier, and I think they are quite related. So firstly, one says, how far back do you go with look-back schemes? So that's sort of first part.
Okay.
And then secondly, someone's asked, is it possible to view and access older versions of the capital funding guide to ascertain if historic milestone claims were compliant with the capital funding guide as it was at the time? So I guess it's a two-part question there. How far do you go back? And actually, is there merit in looking at older versions of the capital funding guide?
Go on, Anya, you again.
Oh, well, yeah, thank you. So in terms of the look-back schemes, all schemes, look-back schemes that completed in the last financial year become eligible for audit. And that window expands only on the in-year schemes, because they could have started a couple of years ago, if not more. And then they are eligible for audit until the 1 year post the completion.
So in other words, and in year one, you could have a big scheme that's phased. You could have hundreds of units. Some of our providers have that. So in year could span 3, 4, 5 years potentially. Look back, as you said, it's if it's completed within the last financial year.
Correct.
And that's why we do the in-year, for that very reason. They can, you could be finding that the schemes that are 3, 4, 5 years long, and we want to capture, are there any particular compliance issues as they've gone through the process, rather than catching them at the end. There could be some good practice, there could be some recommendations for those schemes in progress and in flight that we'd want to relay to providers through this process.
Absolutely. Be mindful as well that if your in-year scheme has been audited in a particular year, and then you claim the practical completion, the following financial year, that scheme is still eligible for audit as a completed scheme.
So we catch you at the end. Don't think if you've been in the year, you potentially, it's not caught, you could get potentially selected as well, at completion and post-completion stage.
I think there was the second part of the question as well, not necessarily related, but there is no other post versions of capital funding guide that you can access. I think the update emails, to which link will be provided to you in the slides, will point you to the update emails tells you which chapter has been updated on what topic, but it doesn't give you the reference to the previous version, unfortunately. We'll get those questions. But
it doesn't really matter, does it? Because the latest version is that version that you will be audited against.
That's true.
If that makes sense.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you. We've got a question that's just pinged up in the chat, which I think is a good one. If you bid into Homes England for the first time, are you guaranteed to be audited because it's your first scheme?
No, you're not, because we
But
said
you
before,
might be.
but you may be. So be prepared, because like we said, be prepared to be audited on 100% on your schemes. But as we said before, we only audit a selection. So automatically the answer is no. You're only guaranteed if you were previously audited and received red or amber grade.
Brilliant, fantastic. I'd like to ask Jane, you talked about the support that you got from Homes England. Could I ask if you also received support from peers? Did you look to other local authorities for support? And if not, who did you turn to? Because there's a lot of chat around peer-to-peer support and asking for advice. So it'd be good to get your thoughts on that. And then Anya and Sharon, maybe if you could come in to give some guidance on perhaps not always relying too heavily on peers, because actually I'm presuming you are the oracle. You don't want people to share inadvertent practice that's not the best. We start with you, Jane.
Yeah, thanks. A lot of support was given internally within the council. We didn't necessarily look outside beyond talking to our Homes England partners, but we worked closely with internal audit within the council. They were really helpful in making sure we were getting that really independent and objective view of what we were doing. And there was a really clear message from the chief executive and the leadership team that this is an issue for the whole council. We've got this wrong, that's not good, but we've got to make sure this doesn't happen again, be very open about this and work together to make sure that the whole of the council's behind this and that you can escalate things if there are risks. So it was a really, and it's part of the general culture within Rotherham that approach would be taken. We didn't look to speak to peers outside the council, but perhaps it would be helpful to have more dialogue around compliance in cross-council working groups, just to raise awareness.
You're setting yourself up, Jane, for another task. You better stop now. It'll be a good practice group that you're leading in the next few weeks, mightn't it, if you carry on?
I will shut up.
And we hopefully support. So, when Anya's team have done their job, as it were, it goes over to another part of my world, which is provider management or delivery, who are the mainstays, points of contact for organisations such as Rotherham. So we help organisations through that. It's incumbent upon, in the case, for example, of Rotherham, to improve, but we do support as much as we can and help along that journey, and anything we can do to give hints, to give support, to tell us our experience of maybe ways to do things and to improve. We will always lend that as well whenever we can, that support. I have a great team of about 30 in delivery who help support providers in all sorts of ways through that journey.
Fantastic. We just had a comment in the chat saying definitely a good idea, and communication with Homes England is essential. So a lot of support there and backing. Wonderful. So thinking about worst case scenario, and I think you've made it clear that most audits actually do not go to this extreme. But someone's asked, are there any circumstances where grant would be clawed back by Homes England?
Simply yes.
Okay.
So you can imagine
Yes.
that's an absolute extreme, where we actually
Okay.
found something maybe fraudulent or something where we really believe they weren't eligible to claim that grant in the first place. So we do ultimately reserve that right to claw back. So another thing, not for today and not for bedtime reading, you've got enough on compliance audit, but compliance audit and compliance to the capital funding guide is part of the contract a provider signs when they get affordable housing grant. They sign a contract, and within that, ultimately, that's what could happen. It's very, very, very rare though, isn't it, that it's gone to those lengths. But ultimately, we do have that ability if needs be. We have to, don't we? If it's been inappropriately used or isn't eligible, you know, we've got to have that ultimate sanction, haven't we, Anya?
Absolutely, and I think it is clearly mentioned in the contract, isn't it?
Yeah, it's public funding, isn't it?
Yeah.
Absolutely. Okay. It's really clear. Thank you. So another question that's come in the chat, which I think it'd be good for Sharon and Anya to help us with. Are councils selected for developer-led projects? For example, builder receiving funding to build a portion of affordable on a market development, or is it just partnership council-led projects, e.g. where a partner developer has won a bid to develop council-owned land?
So I'll try and answer this and answer it in a different way, and Anya can tell me whether, you know, this is right or not. Sorry to put you in it, Anya. It's whoever's received the grant, isn't it? See, I've got a good yes or nod, so I do know what I'm talking about there. So it's in whoever's claimed that grant. So if a developer has, they are therefore eligible to be selected for compliance and compliance audit for that scheme. If it's a local authority-led scheme and they've received the grant, it's whoever's received the grant basically is then eligible to be part of that sample, isn't it, for audit?
To make it maybe simple, if you think who pressed the button on a claim submission screen on IMS,
who's got the grant?
That RP is responsible for complying with the regulations.
Great, really interesting. And very clear. So we do have a question from earlier on. You did mention that a lot of the programme is delivered through modern methods of construction, and of course the programme is trying to increase that delivery. But someone's asked the question, are there any plans to do a specific MMC compliance focus? So would you do a separate, I think this is what the question means, and if it's not, please correct me in the chat, a separate MMC compliance audit?
No, there's your answer. MMC is the way in which you deliver it. So what we're talking about is, you know, you'd still got to have a valuation for the site as an example. You've still got to have a building contract.
Sorry, meant programme. So a separate an MMC focus programme.
There won't be. It'll always be part of a wider AHP, in other words, a wider affordable housing programme, and therefore the audits of those schemes that have followed modern methods of construction might have a bit of different nuance of some questions and requirements, and that's what we're looking at because it's slightly different. But the vast majority of the end-to-end process remains the same. It's just a proportion of it that's relevant to MMC.
Different delivery method, isn't it?
Correct.
So can be applied under different programs.
Fantastic. Right. We have a question here that asks, what are the repercussions of failing to meet milestone dates? We're good to get Anya and Sharon's reflections, and Jane, if you have any personal experience of this, you can throw your thoughts in. Should we start with Sharon and Anya?
Are we on about milestone in terms of generally with projects and schemes, aren't we? I'm guessing. So I can put my other hat on, where I lead the delivery team within affordable housing. And I think it's not a thing. I think what's important to say to everybody on the call who's delivering affordable housing at the moment, that it's a really tough time, isn't it, to be delivering? You've got a lot of cost inflationary pressures. You've got supply chain issues. You've post-pandemic. You've got you've got a lot of SMEs who are struggling at the moment. So we're being very sympathetic towards providers who speak to us early, tell us about the issues they have, and explain why milestones might not be achieved. Because if we understand why, and that's been shared with members of my team, then I don't know, say a start on site date of June. If you've shared, early doors, in dialogue with us, all of the issues, it's going to go to the right and not be June, and it doesn't apply left of field and we don't know about it. Well, we're sympathetic towards that, and we work with our providers, especially in the context of what I've just said. It's really, really challenging for you guys to be delivering affordable housing, and we understand that. So it'll be challenging. We're always challenging, but I think we're really in listening mode with all of our partners at the moment, and are working with you to give you as much flexibility as we can, because we're all in it, aren't we, again, to achieve and enable successful delivery. Yeah, and you're delivering it, not us. You're doing the hard bit, and we, as I said, we really, really understand that at the moment, don't we, Anya?
Yeah, absolutely. I think maybe in addition, sorry, Jane, I just wanted to mention, in addition, the IMS as a point of reference, and the need for updating those changes directly in there, because that follows with the approval from Homes England.
Yeah,
and
so you've got to move the dates. Tell us early, and we'll challenge back, but in the context of what I've just said, you know, things going to the right are quite typical at the moment, and we do understand that from our partners. Sorry, Jane.
No, I'm sorry for interrupting you. And I was just going to echo that, really, about that early dialogue. Also, not having milestones at the end of quarters, definitely not at the end of financial years where you can avoid it, and not thinking that achieving that milestone date must be done at all costs. Don't sacrifice ensuring everything's compliant before you draw down just to hit a date that's been agreed. I'm speaking from experience.
Thank you, Jane. That's spot on. That's absolutely spot on. Yeah. It's important that that product is right for you. So there's that push in March to get a completion. We're always pushing for that as much as we can. But if you come back, Rotherham, and say they're really not finished, or the quality isn't to the right standard, you know, we accept that. It's not ready, is it?
Fantastic. I think the message there is to keep talking. You will take a pragmatic approach, and there's some chat there, you know, talking about how it's good to talk with the Homes England team, and you'll be as supportive as possible. Okay, fantastic. I think we've done a really good job going through as many questions as we can. There is a question in there regarding first homes, and it may be worth us popping an email address for people if they are wondering about first homes. We have a different first homes team, and maybe if you'd like to email us, and we can send you in the direction of the right person within Homes England. Do you think that's the appropriate answer there?
Absolutely. First Homes is now part of affordable housing, so they've come into Jackie Jacobs as under Jackie Jacobs' wing as the Director of Affordable Housing, led by Andy Nelson, but they're the absolute experts in First Homes. It is a bit of a nuanced programme, so you're right, putting them into contact with Andy and his team is order of the day. I'm not an expert on First Homes, I've got to be honest.
But you are experts in so many other things. I was going to say so much more, but get into trouble. So many other things. And I just want to say a big thank you to Jane, Sharon, and Anya for joining us this afternoon, and to everybody who's in the audience. And also, if you have a question that wasn't answered today, have a look at that email address and send your question to us, and we'll see if we can get an answer to you as soon as possible. Thanks so much for joining us. Thank you. Goodbye.